We're going to explore gendered innovations. Gendered Innovations, as was mentioned, was produced through a broad collaboration across the European Union, the US, Stanford University was involved. We have expanded into South Korea, and we hope soon into Japan. Gendered Innovations brought together more than 80 basic scientists and engineers with gender experts, and I'd like to show you some of the fruits of our work. We want to say that integrating sex and gender into science can lead to discovery. So the operative question is, how can we harness the creative power of sex and gender analysis for discovery? Does considering gender add a valuable dimension to research? Does it take your research in new directions? But first, a bit of background. People tend to get these things mixed up and confused, and I like to look at 3 strategic approaches that governments and universities have taken over the last few decades. The first is fix the number of women, or focusing on increasing the numbers of women participating in science and engineering. The second is fix the institutions. What a lot of the interesting stuff here today was about implicit bias and that sort of thing. So fixing the institution promotes gender equality in careers through structural change in research organizations. When I was director of the Clayman Institute, we did a big report on dual career academic couples, which has a lot to do with women's academic careers, because women more often than men have professional and also academic partners. But I'm going to focus on Fix the Knowledge, or gendered innovations, which stimulates excellence in science and technology by integrating sex and gender analysis into research. So we'll focus on this. It's the newest and hottest area, and I think the most important for the future of science, engineering, and innovation. This is what gendered innovations is all about. Let's get started. Doing research wrong costs lives and money. 10 drugs were recently withdrawn from the US market because of life-threatening health effects, and 8 of those pose greater threats for women. Not only does developing a drug cost billions of dollars, I think it's around $5 billion now, but when drugs fail, they cause human death and suffering. We can't afford to get it wrong. Doing research right saves lives and money, and I'm taking this example. I like these kinds of metrics and would like to develop more of these. This is about women's health. It's not exactly the same thing as gendered innovation, which is about integrating sex and gender analysis into all research. But if we look at an analysis of the US Women's Health Initiative hormone therapy trial, which was the big government trial done in the 1990s, we find that for every dollar spent, $140 were returned. And the study also saved lives. There were 76,000 fewer cases of cardiovascular disease, 126,000 fewer breast cancers, 145 more quality-adjusted life years. And although there were more osteoporotic fractures, the overall benefits from this particular research project was to enhance life and save money for the US health system. It's crucially important to get the research right from the very beginning. This is the goal of the Gendered Innovations Project. This project does 2 basic things. We develop state-of-the-art methods of sex and gender analysis, and we provide case studies or concrete examples to show how gender analysis leads to discovery and innovation. So I'm going to take you to one of our examples. The first example comes from cells and tissues and looks specifically at stem cell therapies. So let's go back to why 10 drugs were withdrawn from the market. These days, as I said, a drug can cost billions of dollars to develop. There are many reasons why drugs fail, and fail more often for women. One reason is that research is done in males, whether human, animals, or cells and tissues. And here's a very good study done by one of our colleagues at Berkeley. It shows the sex of the animals used in research in this particular journal for the year 2011. And the blue indicates that males are used more often than females in all areas except reproduction and immunology. But what I'm interested in is this gray area over here, where the sex of the animal was not even reported. This is research money wasted. You might as well throw it out the window because you can't use any of that data in meta-analysis. Say you have a study that needs to be powered up. This is research that you cannot use again. So as I understand it, a lot of you are studying cells. So a colleague of mine at Mayo Clinic, also in 2011, did a similar study for cells and tissues. And here there's only gray area. The sex of the cell is almost never reported. So again, this is research money wasted. And now I want to take you live to our website because this resource is available to everyone. We developed methods of sex and gender analysis, which we reduced to 12 basic approaches. Now, if you're a humanist like I am, you would be, I don't know, freaking out right at this moment, but we wanted to present the basic questions that you ask as you approach research to include sex and gender. I'm not going to go over those today, but these are our case studies. These are our examples, and we have them in buckets for science, health and medicine, engineering, and environment, and I want to talk to you first about stem cell research. So you can just come in here and use this website. We tried to make it work as fast in India as it does at Stanford, and you at MIT, you're blazing hot here, so that's good news. So why might the sex of a cell be relevant? Research shows that there are sex differences in the therapeutic capacity of stem cells, and this slide shows stem cells taken from muscle tissues and indicates very simply that female cells are more generative or more active than male cells. Yet very few researchers consider the sex of their cell, and this can lead to failed research. An international team working in Norway and Australia worked with some stem cells in mice, and they appropriately used male mice and female mice. So we gave them an A+ for that part. There's great inflation, of course. We gave them an A for that part of their design. That's excellent design. But they used all female stem cells. This was an unconscious and arbitrary decision. They didn't think about it for a second. It means that in the discovery phase, they did not see anything unique to the male stem cells, nor did they detect important differences in function between male and female cells. The result of not considering the sex of the stem cell was that their male mice died, and they didn't know why. They thought maybe the postdoc made a mistake. If in doubt, blame the postdoc. But eventually, through a gendered innovation workshop in Norway, the team realized that they also had to consider the sex of the cell. And they found that sex matching was offered the best results in their case. They found that male to male and female to female gave the best results. But of course, you have to consider all of the options. It's research until, before you know what will work. But of course, it's never that easy. One of our methods that we have is analyzing factors intersecting with sex and gender. And even when you're looking at cells, in this case stem cells, it's important to look at the type of disease that you're treating and what kind of cells you might use, but you have to consider also intersecting factors such as hormonal environments, immunological, and basic environmental issues. So let me just interject here. One second. Sex matching may be important for stem cell research, but it can also be important for human organ transplant. For heart transplant, for example, sex matching yields the best 15-year outcomes. And the same is also true for kidney transplant. Lung transplant doesn't follow this pattern. So again, you have to do the research first. And you can't make any assumptions. Everything has to be examined. So that is the best sex outcome if you're analyzing sex. But there's a gender aspect to human transplant, and that is that women donate the most organs. So your surgeon may know the best outcomes for sex, but may not, in fact, because of gender relations in our society, may not, in fact, have a supply of those organs to use for transplant. So I'll get back to gender in a moment. I'd like to say more about that. Recognizing the importance of analyzing sex, the National Institutes of Health requires that sex be included as a biological variable in all NIH research. This is new and came online January 1st. In this really excellent article, Janine Clayton, who's the director of the Office for Research on Women's Health, emphasizes that reporting the sex of cells and tissues, when that information is reliable, is important to ensuring excellence in basic research. An even better resource for research design is this article by Shaw et al., Do You Know the Sex of Your Cell? So I can't tell you how many researchers I've talked to who've never thought about the sex of your cell. I take these exercise classes at Stanford, that Stanford is, let's be well, and they self-insured a while back, so now they get us all to go to these exercise classes, and there's a cell biologist doing her Pilates right next to me. And so we started chatting, because I really can't bear holding your thing for an hour, a minute, seems like an hour. Anyway, I said, well, what's the sex of your cell? And she had never thought about it. She ran back to her lab, found out that the donor for this cell line was a male, about 18 years old, and they'd never considered how that might be impacting all of their particular research. So this article from Shaw provides a table. You can know the sex of your cell. He and his colleagues went through the American Journal of Physiology Cell for the past decade, and this is just the first part of their table. It shows the sex of every cell. But of course, other problems arise. Transcription and translation may be influenced by the components of animal serum present in cell culture medium. So phenol red, for example, can exert estrogenic effects. Researchers also worry about cost, especially in animal research. They worry that needing more study subjects and control groups will run up the cost of their experiments. The important point here, however, is that cost in this early phase of research is minimal compared to the cost of human trials, clinical trials. And as Janine Clayton has put it, late-stage clinical studies that draw from a body of research that is incomplete due to the lack of consideration of a key biological variable such as sex may harm humans and lead to failures in drug development. So this is really important. There are many things that you can look at for methods, and the ones that we know for cells and tissues are loaded up here on our checklists. This checklist we developed this in conjunction with Virginia Miller at Mayo Clinic, and using cells from both sexes ensures that the cells for which you develop diagnostics and therapeutic interventions represent the whole population. One clue or potential place to start research is to consider sex disparity in disease severity that might suggest underlying sex or gender-based influences on physiology or pathological processes. Now, much progress has been made in this area, and if you go to our checklist on health and medicine, you see that there are 3 basic volumes here. These are showing sex and gender differences for medical school. And they go through the organs of the body and talk all about sex disparities in disease. And this might be a good place for you to start to see what you might want to focus on. Another point I want to make is that researchers need to analyze sex. And this is one of our basic methods here, analyzing sex. And when you do this, it's very important not to just talk about sex differences, but also similarities. So this chart is just charts height differences between men and women in the United States. Very simple, non-controversial, so I can show it. But it's really important as you're analyzing sex that you look at the differences between males, among males. Males are not all the same. Females are not all the same. And then there is also overlap. So you have to look at the between group differences and the differences within your groups. People, because of the publication bias, people tend to emphasize sex differences. And then we get some of this brain research that says, oh, there are female brains, there are male brains. We have to also emphasize similarity, but this is not news. And journals may not publish it. So one of my colleagues at Berkeley was saying, well, we ought to do a website of all known sex differences and similarities for animal research, which is his field, and he realized that that was kind of impossible to do. But for our lit reviews, we need journals to publish both difference and similarity. We don't want to overemphasize difference, even though these are sometimes incredibly important. Importantly, how to analyze sex and gender is not a part of the curriculum in medical schools or in many basic sciences. I think it might be a matter of life and death whether we include this information in medical schools. But let me just say a little bit about policy in this regard. Policy is one driver of discovery and may help encourage scientists and engineers to integrate sex and gender analysis into their research. And as I just said, NIH implemented their new policy on sex only. They haven't dropped the gender shoe. So on sex in January of this year. But the NIH is behind in this respect. And since I'm a historian, I also put policy up on our website. And this shows you granting agencies and their policy on fixing the numbers of women, fixing the institutions, but I focused here on research councils that have a requirement on including sex or gender in your research design. So the European Union, the European Commission, is the global leader in this respect. In December 2013, the European Union launched Horizon 2020, and they identified 137 areas of science and technology where gender analysis could benefit research. These areas included computer hardware and architecture, nanotechnology, oceanography, geoscience, organic chemistry, aeronautics, et cetera, so certainly it includes biomedical research. Other granting agencies of note are the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Since 2010, all 13 Canadian Institutes of Health Research have requested applicants to consider sex and gender in their research. So they are now in the process of giving teeth to this policy because they're debating what % of the score this should be. So that will have a real impact. And I wanted to draw your attention to their online trainings that they put up. They have 3 excellent trainings, which are technical and interesting for people in your field of research. 2 of them went up this week. And Canada is well on the road to transforming medicine by increasing the pace of new discoveries, diminishing errors of extrapolation between sexes, and mitigating adverse events in the development process. So far, I've been talking about sex, and I want to now open the discussion to gender. And I'm hoping that you know the difference between the two, but in fact, sex and gender interact, and that's something that I want to emphasize here. This is an image prepared by Vera Regitsa-Grosek, who is a world-famous cardiologist, and she's also heading one of the big gender medicine institutes in Berlin, so in Europe. In Europe, they call it gender medicine. We don't really have quite the same term. Now, the point of this is that biology, so genes and sex hormones and the like, influence an individual over the course of their lifetime, but also gender or social factors influence and interact with biology over the course of a lifetime. So these gender influences can be in diet, can be in exercise, we could add education, we could add partnering practices. There are a lot of daily practices having to do with gender in society which influence health. Sex influences health by modifying behavior, and at the same time, gender behaviors interact with and influence biology, and that's why we care. For example, as we know, exercise can strengthen bone, or social discrimination can lead to stress, which in turn impacts health. And these social or environmental factors differ a lot by gender. Authors in peer-reviewed journals often use the word gender when they mean sex. So you can't actually do a proper lit review. We're trying to do something right now, and it's just a mess. So my point is that the word sex and gender are not interchangeable. They are technical terms, and they need to be used precisely. And I know there are a lot of journal editors in the room, and you need to hold the line. Okay, there we go. So policies for reporting research results in relation to sex and gender are important. And I want to point to, if you are an editor of a journal, we put up the great policies that journals have. And I guess I'll point here to the American Journal of Physiology, Cell Physiology. They require that the source of the cells should be clearly indicated and should indicate the species, the sex, the strain, race, and age of donor. So that's a very good start. Now, a group of us we're currently trying to standardize editorial policies for reporting sex and gender in research papers, and I, along with Holly, who will be addressing you soon, Holly Falk-Krasinski, I think I get extra points for saying that name. So we have just finished a white paper to standardize reporting for sex and gender in biomedicine. And she has taken it to Elsevier, which controls over 1,000 journals. It's now going to the ICMJE, the Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and the Council of Science. So I think we can get better precision in our research if we have granting agencies at the beginning of the process and journals, peer-reviewed journals, at the end of the process coordinating to make sure that we take into consideration these important variables. So let me now get back to gender. I've said a lot about sex. Many people think of gender as gender identity, but it's much more than that, and I have a few little visual aids for you. So gender, let me say first, gender consists of three, probably more, but three important aspects: gender norms, gender identities, and gender relations. Gender norms, because it's a social thing, it's not, gender identity is just so personal, right? It's all about you. But gender norms are about the society you're born into. Gender norms are those unspoken cultural rules that silently police your behavior. Gender norms, it's those things that press in on people, are produced through social institutions, through the workplace, family culture, state and federal law, national culture. I mean, for example, we just had state and federal laws that allow gay marriage. Okay, that's a gender norm. We've now freed that up, right? We've changed that so individuals can act differently. So gender norms are very important and important to understand in your research. The next, of course, is gender identity, and that just goes the other way. We, as historical individuals, can influence our culture. And so you can develop a gender identity where you press back on those norms. Again, the whole gay marriage thing is a good example of that. People push back on the norm, and now the norm has been changed, so the next generation will have a different experience. And finally, there's gender relations, and that is, if this were a video, all of these would be in action. It is the relationship between people, the power relationship between people of different genders. So not only do you have norms in society and you push back, but when I walk into the room, I start having a negotiation of what are the rules of our interaction? And gender, ethnicity, will be one of those sets of rules. So we are negotiating all of the time. So gender is complex. And one issue that is important right now is how to reduce gender to variables. Now, again, I'm glad my people aren't here, because social scientists and humanists, when we talk about gender, it's all very complex. We have vast narrative structures to discuss it all, but this won't work in the medical sciences. For the medical sciences, and just bear with me a second here. In the medical sciences, the question is, can we reduce gender to a variable so that we can manipulate it statistically? And let me report on a new study, which is out of Canada. I think it's interesting that it's out of Canada because Canada has had the policies supporting this kind of focus on sex and gender for the longest. So we find a lot of the new exciting stuff in this field out of Canada. We in the United States better catch up. So this is a new study predicting outcomes after acute coronary syndrome in people aged 55 or younger. And this is, of course, human research. The study asks why some patients have higher incidence of recurrent ACS and death after 12 months after diagnosis. To do the study, Pelletier, Ditto, and Pilote, they're also French-Canadian, reduced sex to a variable, which is straightforward, and they found no difference between men and women. The PIs then also reduced gender to variables, and this I find very interesting. In this study, the team, after testing 17 variables, found 7 that were significant and developed a gender-related score from this. So they had these scales that patients score themselves on. They were interested in who is the primary earner in the household, what are the number of hours spent doing housework each week, what's your overall personal income, what are your stress levels at home, and then they used these two sex role inventories are no longer valid, so we are suggesting they cannot be used anymore, but that's what they used. And these they then controlled for sex, age, the GRACE score, previous cardiovascular events, and all the traditional cardiovascular risks. It's a very good study. So the result is that they found no sex difference, but they found that gender matters. So patients received a gender-related score of between 1 and 100. Patients with a higher femininity score were more likely to experience a recurrence of ACS, regardless of whether they were a man or a woman. So a man with a high femininity score was more likely to suffer a recurrence than a woman with a high and a woman with a high masculinity score was not. So I think there are problems with this methodology because I would never want to be in a position where I'm giving a man a femininity score. So what we've done is teamed up with this group, and Stanford has now launched a project to look at how you would reduce gender to variables for this kind of work. We're hoping to create a gold standard for scoring gender factors in health and disease. So we shall see how that works. As I said, we got stuck already on the lit review because you can't distinguish sex and gender properly in the literature, but we're working with that. So gendered innovations, then we have done 26 specific, where's my website here? We've done, well, maybe I've lost my website. Okay. Well, anyway, so you've been on the website. So we have 26 specific examples. If you look at those buckets in science, health and medicine, engineering, I didn't get to talk about natural language processing today, which I would love to do. So we have 26 specific examples ranging from osteoporosis research in men to nutrigenomics to assistive technologies for the elderly and so on and so forth. Designing sex and gender analysis into research and innovation is a crucial component contributing to world-class science and medicine. There is much work to be done. Researchers need to learn sophisticated methods of sex and gender analysis. Medical schools are now trying to include that in the curriculum. We at Stanford are trying to include it in the engineering curriculum that is new. Corporations, also companies, need to integrate the insights into product design, including biometric wearables. But eyes have been opened, and we cannot return to a world that ignores gender. Innovation is what makes the world tick, and as I hope I've begun to show, gendered innovation sparks creativity by offering new perspectives, posing new questions, and opening new areas to research. Can we afford to ignore such opportunities? Thank you very much.